sanctified by obeying His word, glorified when returneth my Lord. Cover with His life, whiter than snow, fullness of His life, then shall I know my life was scarlet, my sin and woe. Cover with His life, whiter than snow.
Let's pray. Father Lord, we come until this time. We want to thank you for the singing session that we've had. Thank you for the good voices, oh my God. Even as we go into another session, I pray that the Spirit may be our guide, oh my God, and may you help us to hearken unto each and everything that will be going to be taught, oh my God. And may you help us even to apply it in our daily lives. Be with us till we come to the end. Our prayer by faith in Jesus' name. Amen.
God bless you all.
Praise the Lord again. Praise the Lord. I don't know whether we are tired, but we will try to keep the sessions that are left not too long. That will be a false promise. Now, this hour, we're going to do true education. So this program, we will be dealing with a few aspects of true education. And what I intend to do for the sessions that we shall have for this program is to do an overview of education as God intended it from the beginning, what it has been like, meaning the experience of God's people throughout the ages, and where we are at the moment, and what it is that God wishes or intends for His people in these times. So that's a huge task. I hope the time that I have will allow us to at least do an overview that's a little more comprehensive. And today we want to start at the very beginning. But before we do that, I want us to read this quote. I don't know where this quote is from. It's from the book Education, but I don't know the page. You can find it for yourself. It says our ideas must be either page 1 or 2. Our ideas of education are too narrow. Page 2. Page 2, I'm told. Our ideas of education are too narrow and take too narrow and too low a range. There is need of a broader scope, a higher aim. True education means more than the pursuit of a certain course of study. It means more than a preparation for the life that now is. It has to do with the whole being and the whole period of existence possible to man. And then we go to our most familiar section of that quote, which says it is the harmonious development of the physical, you can say this one with me, and the mental and the spiritual powers. It prepares the student for the joy of service in this world and for the higher joy of wider service in the world to come. We are all familiar with that quote. And that same book, okay, we're going to quote a lot from it. So if you have a copy, you can follow it with me. Although the pages I have here might not correspond with the pages in your copy. But you can use the words to search and follow and find out where I am. According to mine, it's education page 20, paragraph 1. Now it says, the system of education instituted at the beginning of the world was to be a model for man throughout all after time. Now I find that really important. So it says the way education began is how education should end. I'm paraphrasing. So that which God intended from the very beginning was intended not just for that period of time, but for all time until the end of the world. So it was to be a model for man throughout all after time. As an illustration of its principles, a model school was established in Eden. So here we have an example of that which God instituted in the beginning. The home of our first parents. Says the Garden of Eden was the schoolroom. Now I'll make you repeat this one. Nature was the lesson book. The Creator himself was the instructor. And the parents of the human family were the students. So let us go through that again, because I do not wish to have you forget this once. Now, what was the schoolroom? I just want to be sure you're with me, and I want to make sure, I want you to be with me also. So by repeating it, you'll be forced to be attentive. So let's go through this again. So what was the schoolroom? The Garden of Eden. What was the lesson book? Nature was. Who was the instructor? The teacher, was the Creator himself. Who were the first students? Adam and Eve were the first students. Now that was the first school. Must have been wonderful. I wish I was there. I was there in the loins of Adam. Now, because when we read that first quote in education page 2, it says that true education is the harmonious development of how many aspects? How many aspects? 3. What was the first one? The physical, the mental, and the spiritual. Now, was that catered for in that first school where Eden was the schoolroom, nature was the lesson book, God the instructor, Adam and Eve as the students? Was that catered for? Now let us look at that. Now this one is page 21 of that same book. It says, in his interest for his children, our Heavenly Father personally directed their education. Then it says, often they were visited by messengers, the holy angels, and from them received counsel and instruction. Often they walked in the cool of the day, in the garden in the cool of the day. Often as they walked in the garden in the cool of the day, they heard the voice of God and face to face held communion with the eternal. Now, which aspect is catered for or was catered for in this manner? The spiritual. And we are told that the thoughts of God towards them were thoughts of good and not of evil. So in that first school, the spiritual aspect was catered for through face-to-face communion with God. And we are told heavenly messengers, angels, were also sent to them, and they would commune with them about God. Now, let's read this quote. This is, let me find out what this is. This is page 22, that same book. It says, the laws and operations of nature and the great principles of truth that govern the spiritual universe were opened to their minds by the infinite author of all. It says, in the light and knowledge of the glory of God, they grew. I am paraphrasing. Then it says, their mental and spiritual powers developed, and they realized the highest pleasures of their holy existence. Now, apparently, when God created man, he was not created at the peak of his mental development, but he was created in a state his for mental development were not compromised. Does that bring out the difference? He was created in a manner unmarred by sin. He was in a position where he could realize development in his mental capacity. So there was a lot to learn. He was not created a walking encyclopedia. He was to discover and learn and acquire knowledge as his life continued. Then we are told to Adam and Eve was committed the care of the garden, to dress it and to keep it. Now, why would God do that? And most of the time when we think about dressing and keeping the garden, what comes to your mind? What's dressing and keeping a garden? What's that? Farming or gardening. So what made the difference between that and what we do now? You don't have to answer me. It says, so rich in all that the owner of the universe could supply, they were not to be idle. Useful occupation was appointed them a blessing to strengthen the body, to expand the mind, and to develop the character. How many aspects are listed there? How many? 3. So in keeping and dressing the garden, they were taking care of the physical, the mental, and the spiritual. So that is an illustration of what God intended from the beginning. And it says, as God awakens, as he awakens a desire to reach God's ideal, he presents an education that is as high as heaven and as broad as the universe. An education that cannot be completed in this life, which is important, because if there was education before sin, then it means education is not a question or a matter for sinful beings. It was God's plan for a world that is sinless. It became God's plan for a sinful world, and it will still be God's plan after sin. Now, because of the manner in which we have been educated, we look at education as a punishment. It is this thing you have to go through, complete it, so that now you can start living your life. That's how we view education. But it was actually a plan for the entire period possible for the existence of man. Now, I want us to have that in mind as we continue. Now, that was the illustration. That was the ideal in the beginning before sin. But as we looked at this matter in the morning, in Genesis chapter 3, what happened? We are told sin came into the world. Now, when sin came into the world, a few things happened. One, that which God used to do in the cool of the day, he could not do anymore. He only came one more time and called out to Adam. And was Adam there gladly running to meet him? No. So something broke. But we are told that in order to understand, this is page 14 of the book Education. I'm reading paragraph 4. You can check whether it corresponds with what you're reading. It says, in order to understand what is comprehended in the work of education, we need to consider both the nature of man and the purpose of God in creating him. We need to consider also the change in man's condition through the coming in of the knowledge of evil, or through the coming in of sin. So we need to consider what happened in order to understand the nature of education that God intends for us. It says, and God's plan for still fulfilling his glorious purpose in education of the human race. So we said when we began that when God instituted the principles of education, he intended them throughout the life of man. So we are told now we need to consider that adapted plan for man's new condition after the entrance of sin. Now, in that adapted condition that was to suit a sinful man or a man that was struggling with sin, do we still have those three aspects catered for? Now, let me read this one. It says, in the divine plan of education as adapted to man's condition after the fall, Christ stands as the representative of the Father. Now, in Eden, what was going on? They were having face-to-face communion with God without an intercessor in between. Now, we are told after the condition, after man fell into sin, now Christ stands as the representative of the Father, the connecting link between God and man. He is the great teacher of mankind. Now, we said in the beginning that Eden was what? The schoolroom. What was that? What was the book? Nature. Who was the instructor? Who was the first student? Adam and Eve. Now we are told after the fall, now Christ stands as the representative of the Father, the great teacher of mankind. So has the instructor changed? Has the instructor changed? Now, I don't know why people are so unsure about their answers. Has the instructor changed? No, the instructor has not. The instructor has not changed. God is still the instructor. But now we are told Christ stands as the representative. Why Christ? Because he comes with his divinity veiled with what? With humanity, so that a sinful man can withstand his sight. But who is still the instructor? It is still God himself. So that has not changed even after the fall. Now it says, he is the great teacher of mankind, and he ordained that men and women should be his representatives. Now, when men take up the work of teaching, is it their work? Are they the instructors? What are they doing? They stand as representatives of Christ. We are told Christ stands as the representative of the Father. So nothing has changed, but now we have a change here. Okay? Now Christ is the great teacher of mankind, but he has ordained men and women to be his representative in giving instruction. Now, it says here, the family was the school. Now we are talking about man's condition after the fall. Now the family becomes the school and the parents, the teachers. Now remember, we are starting from the beginning. I hope I lose no one in this journey. So in the beginning, we still had a school. Who was the instructor? What was the schoolroom? People have traveled and left without me. Who was the instructor? I'm not saying them in the correct order. Okay, what was the schoolroom? Maybe that's how we crammed it. What was the schoolroom? What was the lesson book? Who was the instructor? Who are the first students? Adam and Eve. Then after the fall, who was the instructor? Who was the instructor? God himself. Through who? Jesus Christ as the representative. Through who? Through who? Men and women. And it specifies who are these men and women? I'm hearing things I did not say. Who are these men and women? The parents now become the instructors. Whose job is it? It is God's job as the instructor. So parents here are only representing him. They stand as his representative. Now, so in the early days, after Adam and Eve were driven from the Garden of Eden, now parents became representatives of God, instructing their children in mental and spiritual and physical aspects. Now, let's continue. This is page 33, paragraph 3, the book Education. It says the education centering in the family was that which prevailed in the days of the patriarchs. So as we now go down through the ages, now when we talk about patriarchs, whom are we talking about? Just so that we are together. Name one. Abraham. Yes, he's the most famous of all. Who else? Yeah. Enoch, Isaac, Jacob, Noah. We've exhausted our list. All right, so that's what we are talking about. So it says, in the days of the patriarchs, that education centering on the family is what prevailed. And then it says, for the schools thus established, God provided the conditions most favorable for the development of character. So after the fall, now that became the ideal good, or God's ordained way for educating his people. It says, the people who were under his direction, now talking about the people who were under God's direction here, still pursued the plan of life that he had appointed in the beginning. Now, then it contrasts those people of God and those who were not faithful to him. It says those who departed from God built for themselves cities, and congregating in them gloried in the splendor, the luxury, and the vice that make the cities of today the world's pride and its curse. But the men who held fast God's principles of life dwelt among the fields and hills. They were tillers of the soil and keepers of flocks and herds. Now, in our context today, do we have people who till the soil and keep the herds and live separate from all other people? Do we have them? People are giving me a timid yes. Do we have them? Who are they? Yes? Can you shout that? There are people who are living in the countryside. Those are not necessarily keepers of logs and tillers of the soil. And most of them are trying to do it now. They've never done it. But are there people who do this as that's part of their culture? Do you have people who live like that? Now that's your problem. You overthink. People are giving me the answers. They think I am the answer. So do we have communities that live like that? That are keepers of flocks and who till the land for their livelihood? Yes. What are those which communities? Do we have examples? Yes? Yes, but we don't know them here. There are very few people who know that. Here, do we have people who do that? Yes. Who are they? The Maasai. No? Who else? The kisses. Now, if I were to ask you how many kisses are in this room, then you would be sure they are not stealers of the soil and keepers of flocks and herds. So, okay, let's use the Maasai as our example, okay? Now, what do we honestly think of them? Our honest opinion. A low life. What do we think they need? Exposure. They need to be exposed. They need to be taken out of that life and exposed to civilization. Now, in those days, we are told those people who are faithful to God, what did they do? They went and lived among the fields and hills. They became tillers of the soil and keepers of flocks. And we are told in this free, independent life, what were they seeking? Freedom and independence, so that they would worship God as they pleased. Now, you can imagine the temptations of children who grew up in that kind of life. And we're looking at other children in the cities, all clean and sophisticated. The allure of the cities was great. But it says those who are sticklers to the commandments of God went and lived that manner of life. So in this free, independent life, with its opportunities for labor and meditation, they learned of God and taught their children his works and ways. Now, those are the days of the patriarchs. And if we were to be realistic, it was not an enviable life unless you knew what you were seeking. It was not the kind of life the rest of the world looked at and said, that is what we want to live like. It was always people who do not wish to mix with other people. Now, those were the days of the patriarchs. Now, fast forward to the constitution of the nation of Israel. And we are told that the great principles of education are unchanged. They do not change. They stand forever and ever, for they are the principles of the character of God. So what did God intend with the children of Israel? Now let me read this. This is education page 34, paragraph 2, for those who are reading with me. It says, this was the method of education that God desired to establish in Israel. Now, which method? This is more or less a continuation of the other one. Which method? Who were the instructors? The parents. What was supposed to be the schoolroom in this context? Nature. It was the schoolroom, it was the lesson book. Okay? How many are? 3. What was the first one? Physical, spiritual, mental. So all those 3 were supposed to be catered in that form of education. Now it says this was the method of education that God desired to establish in Israel. But when brought out of Egypt, there were among the Israelites few prepared to be workers together with him in the training of their children. So when God constituted that nation of Israel, his plan for education had not changed. It did not change. But it says those who were his appointed representatives were not ready for that job. It says the parents themselves needed instruction and discipline. So the instructors were not qualified. So the instructors needed instruction themselves. So the parents themselves needed instruction and discipline. It says they were victims of lifelong slavery. They were ignorant, untrained, degraded. They had little knowledge of God and little faith in him. They were confused by false teaching and corrupted by their long contact with heathenism. Now God desired to lift them to a higher moral level. And to this end, he sought to give them a knowledge of himself. Go 10 pages after that quote to 44, paragraph 3. It says, a knowledge of God, fellowship with him in study and labor, likeness to him in character were to be the source, the means, and the aim of Israel's education. The education imparted by God to the parents and by them to be given to their children. So when these people were brought from slavery, from Egypt, and they became a nation, we are told God's plan did not change. But they were not qualified to carry out God's plan. So did God change the plan? No, he did not change the plan. Instead, we are told he sought to instruct the parents to qualify them for the work that was truly theirs. So he did not come up with a different plan, but he tried to educate them and train them and qualify them to be instructors on his behalf. Now, how are they supposed to carry out 3 aspects? Now, in their journey from Egypt to Canaan, God did it in a way that they would never forget. And we are told during the day what would happen. They had a pillar of cloud. During the night, a pillar of fire. So every day, every night, when they looked up, they remembered that God was with them. It has never been the intention of God that communion between him and man should be broken in any way. So he sought to impress them with the fact that he was a God who is near and not afar. the images of heathenism that they were used to in Egypt. And we are told as they journeyed, Moses was also instructed that most of their memory and the wonderful works of God would be impressed upon their memories through the means of song. So they would sing in their journey, and the songs became a source of instruction for them. Now, their thoughts were uplifted from the trials and difficulties of the way, and the restless, turbulent spirit was soothed and calmed. And on top of that, we are told the principles of truth were implanted in the memory. Their faith was strengthened, and concert of action taught order and duty. Now, all the things I am reading here are things that would probably have required 52 units to complete. The simple ways in which God implanted the truth into their memories are things that in today's ways of trying to educate people, you would probably break into 1,000 units. But we're told, how did he do it? He did not sit them down and give them a theory of who he was. Instead, he took them through experiences that would actually reveal him to them. And after each experience, they would sing to make sure that that memory never left their thoughts. He taught them faith. Now remember, in the earlier quote, page 44, the one I read, I said that a knowledge of God, fellowship in him in study and labor, likeness to him in character, were to be the source, the means, and the aim of Israel's education. So the experiences he made them go through were supposed to teach them who God was, develop faith in him, and make sure they would never forget. They did not have to grant that. They experienced it. But we'll talk about that another time. And we are told the people were brought closer, into closer touch with God and with one another. Now let's read another quote. That was spiritual. So God impressed them with his presence, with how near he was to them. And then, page 36, verse 4, paragraph 4, says, great was the privilege and honor granted Israel in the preparation of the sanctuary. And great was the responsibility. So God knew these people did not just need spiritual impression. They did not just need to know that he was near. They also needed to develop their mental aspect. And we are told a structure of surpassing splendor, demanding for its construction the most costly material, and highest artistic skill was to be created in the wilderness by a people just escaped from slavery. And we are told it seemed a stupendous task. But he who had given the plan of building stood pledged to cooperate with the builder. And then there is this statement says, what an industrial school was that in the wilderness. Having the instructor in its instructor Christ and his angel. And then continues to say there was labor for both hand and brain. So what was God trying to do for them? Now he deals with their spiritual aspect, and then he gives them something to do so that they would develop their mental capacity. And so great and marvelous was that development that years later, after Israel had become a nation, some of the people who got artistic skills, the wisdom to craft things in the temple, were taken by other nations. When Solomon was building his temple, he had to go to a foreign nation to borrow the talent that was originally in Israel. So developed was that talent, that mental capability, through the simple task, simple from our perspective today, the simple task of just building the temple. There was enough labor for their mental development and for their physical development as well. And there is a lot we can look at as far as that physical development is concerned. Now we know these people did not take a train. They walked all the way from Egypt to Canaan. But I like the way it is put. It says, when the cloud stood, they did what? They camped. When it arose, they did what? They proceeded with the journey. It was exercise under God's instruction. It was not the 42-kilometer marathon run in a day. They went with the pace that God deemed best for everyone involved. Now we can talk a lot about that. Now he cared about, but we do not have time. Now we can look at nutrition. What did he give them? He gave them manna. Now in that first school in Eden, did he need to instruct them on their food? Yes. Were they sinful? No. And yet, God still came into, decided to lay out his plan. So that later, even after man fell, we could always look back and see what the ideal was. And in our journey, in trying to reconcile with God, we can always walk towards the direction where we came from in the beginning. So I like this one. It says, everything that concerned their well-being was the subject of divine solicitude. There is nothing that concerned the well-being of Israel that God did not give instructions concerning. So every single thing about their lives came under God's solicitude, and he gave instructions. Says, and came within the providence of divine law. That is page 38 for those who are noting. Page 38, I think it's paragraph 2. Now we know about the laws of sanitation. I do not want to get into those. But now listen to the method of instruction. It says, true education is not the forcing of instruction on an unready and unreceptive mind. Now, our understanding of education today is that as long as we think someone needs certain information, what do? We give them the information. If they are not ready, we coerce them into accepting the information. If they cannot be coerced, we force the information into their minds. By all means, you have to receive that which is deemed necessary for you at that time. Now it says true education is not forcing of instruction on an unready and unreceptive mind. The mental powers must be awakened and interest aroused. For this, God's method of teaching provided. He who created the mind and ordained its laws provided for its development in accordance with them. Now, in the home and in the sanctuary, through the things of nature and of art, in labor and in festivity. Now, I want you to remember those things. Let me repeat them. It says, through the things of nature and of art, and in festivity, in sacred building and memorial stone, by methods of rites and symbols unnumbered. God gave to Israel lessons illustrating his principles and preserving the memory of that which he sought to teach them. the memory of his wonderful works. Is how it puts it. Education, page 41. Then as inquiry was made, the instruction impressed mind and heart. Now, I don't think any of us, those of us who are here, there might be a few, I do not, I don't think anyone here has gone through that kind of education. From the beginning, what was our experience? A, B, C, D, okay? We did not even know what those were, but it was time to learn those ones. So we were given those ones. Then, we may not share our experiences today. We will find time to do that. But in God's method, what happens first? He presents a picture, and then when you ask what that is about, then he says, now, I'm glad you asked. This is why this is here. And what happens with that kind of instruction? You never forget. Why? Because who inquired in the first place? You did. He aroused the interest. And then after arousing the interest, information is given. That's always the order. Now you will realize in the instruction of Israel, there was very little of reading and writing. Most of the instruction was oral. Now I am not saying reading and writing does not have its place. I hope I will be understood there because I'm actually reading and writing here. But it did not begin there. It always began with arousal of interest. People had to be brought to a state where they would inquire, why are we slaughtering a lamb? Why do we have this altar of incense? What is this water for? And then they would be instructed in the ways of God. And that would be passed on from parents to children. And in turn, when they were old enough, they would pass it on to their children. Or at least that was God's intention. Now, we know it didn't happen. Now, this is education page 43 now. It says, the author of all beauty, himself a lover of the beautiful, God provided to gratify in his children the love of beauty. He made provision also for their social needs, for the kindly and helpful associations that do so much to cultivate sympathy and to brighten and sweeten life. Now, it says, as a means of education, an important place was filled by the feasts of Israel. Now, when we read about the feasts of Israel, how many times were they to meet in a year? I had someone mention it this morning. It was devotion time. Not sure. How many times were they to meet in a year? 7. 3 times. The instruction was 3 times a year all your males